Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
I'm Nathan Kiker. Welcome to our podcast, Clearer Than Truth. I'm glad to be joined by my co-host, George Bogdan.
The wisdom of former Secretary of State Dean Acheson inspires our episodes. We emphasize clarity while examining the intricate global issues of today for a diverse audience.
In a world where time is limited, we distill complex ideas, making them not just comprehensible, but in Acheson's words, clearer than truth. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Today is Monday, November 25th. I'm Nathan Kiker. Our guest today is Joby Warrick. Joby is a journalist for the Washington Post, where he writes about the Middle East, diplomacy, and national security. He has received 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Before we dive into our interview with Joby, let's take a look at the news of the day. Prosecutors have dropped charges against President-elect Trump in his election interference case and in a classified documents case. In the Middle East, Israel and Lebanon appear to be close to a ceasefire deal. In the war in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine continue to trade airstrikes, further escalating the conflict. With that, let's jump into our interview. Joby, thanks for joining us today.
Nathan, it's a pleasure. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, so you've spent years covering some of the most critical security challenges in the Middle East. How has your understanding of the region's complexities evolved throughout your career, especially in the wake of the major geopolitical shifts, such as the rise of ISIS, which was the topic of one of your books?
Well, it's been a humbling experience overall, in the sense that just when you think you have things figured out, then suddenly you realize you don't. That the complexity is just, it can often be just nesting dolls with one and inside another, and just one riddle and one mystery, and wrapped up in another. And it's interesting as a thing to cover because you're always learning, but it always challenges your assumptions. It kind of forces you to acknowledge how little you understand, even if you spent years working on this stuff. It's always harder and always more complicated than you think it is going in. And that's been a lesson, I think, that not just for journalists, but policymakers have had to learn this again and again. It's a very tough region to get your head around.
So I think most of our listeners are aware of some of the conflicts in the Middle East today, which I would like to get to later on. But it took a long time for us to get here. In your book, Black Flags, you chart the rise of ISIS and the conditions that allowed it to flourish. What do you think were the most critical turning points in the fight against ISIS, and how have they reshaped the political landscape in the Middle East?
Yeah. How we fought ISIS and how we did that successfully is actually a great story. How we got into the mess to start with, that's not such a great story, but the sort of the one thing that worked, and the one thing that I think we can look back on with some pride, is that we found a true multilateral solution to the ISIS problem. This was a challenge that was threatening many countries throughout the Middle East and around the world as this group began to metastasize and draw in foreign fighters from around the world. The solution was a multinational coalition of 87 countries, ultimately, with boots on the ground, mostly people fighting for their own lands. So Iraqis and Syrians, other Arabs joining in the fight and making it, a truly unified effort. And wonderful thing about ISIS, I guess, is that it's so universally hated and makes enemies with everyone, around it, including its neighbors and people who could be potential allies. It just infuriates and upsets everyone. So it wasn't so hard to bring this coalition together. But that is how we managed to defeat this contagion fairly quickly. If you think about it, their high watermark was 2015. By 2017, their capitals were falling. By 2019, there was nothing left of it, at least in terms of the caliphate. And I think that is the example that administrations in the future should look to. Not thinking we can do this unilaterally or even bilaterally, but with everybody on board and everybody participating in some way.
As someone who's closely followed the conflicts in Syria, what do you see as the enduring consequences of the Syrian civil war, both for the region specifically, but also for international security?
We're at a situation with Syria that it's much more precarious than I think people realize. And to be honest, people aren't thinking or talking about Syria very much. It's receded from the headlines. The civil war has turned into a stalemate. But what you have essentially now in Syria is a failed state. The Assad government has control over the major cities. It is weak everywhere. It is now sort of an operating zone for the Iranians, for the Russians, and there are sort of enclaves in the country that don't belong to Syria. There's sort of the northwest of the country. There's a a little caliphate, to be honest. It's a group, an area controlled by Islamist groups in the east and in the northeast. There are Kurdish, autonomous groups that control the region and have their own governance. And within this kind of patchwork of competing powers and interests, there's an opportunity for all kinds of bad things to happen. And we see ISIS beginning to again find areas where it can operate, find supporters, find weapons, knock off security checkpoints and small bases on an ongoing basis. And you see Iranians just able to kind of run freely as much as they can without getting smacked by the Israelis occasionally, but moving weapons into the country, supporting their allies in Hezbollah. So there's just so many bad actors, all very much at home in Syria. And then layered on top of that, you have a country where millions of children have not had a decent education, if any at all. Cities are not being rebuilt. We know from our own history, and with Afghanistan in the 70s and 80s, when there's a security vacuum, when there's a lawless region, all kinds of bad things can happen. So I do think that in the future we can expect that some major regional problems at least will start to come from Syria.
When we were talking about ISIS a moment ago, you mentioned how we learned that a multinational approach can work in fighting terrorism. And I guess you could say it sort of worked in the handling of Syria's chemical weapon crisis. But do you think that moving forward, that is the approach in dealing with sort of rogue states and their chemical weapons or other dangerous weapons? Because it does seem that the world really has sort of dropped the ball when it comes to handling these problems. And Syria is kind of an example of success.
The one good thing about multilateralism when it comes to weapons of mass destruction is that it is great to still have that international sanction against using weapons of this kind. Syria very blatantly used chemical weapons against its own people, was called at by the world, and yet it has never wanted to acknowledge even possessing them. It finally did, but it's never acknowledged using them a single time. We've seen the Islamic State tinker with chemical weapons and try to make some of their own, but it's one thing they don't brag about because it's still there's this international taboo against using chemical weapons or biological weapons to kill innocents, and those norms still hold. And I think that's why it's great to see countries move multilaterally to address these threats when they occur. The reality is when the United States and other great powers discover these problems, they are uniquely in a position to try to do something about it. Sometimes it's through covert action or through extreme diplomatic pressure, bringing certain partners together, as we did with the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. But it often does fall to Washington in particular to try to be the world's policeman on things like that, with the support of international treaties and the UN hopefully backing us up. But it's an ongoing problem.
Do you think that will still be possible in a Trump administration, a second Trump administration, after he has taken a very unilateral approach in his first administration?
Yeah, this is the big question, because one thing we didn't see from Trump in the first term was multilateralism. He just doesn't seem to either value it, or maybe his folks just don't quite understand it or don't want to take the trouble. It's always about the United States acting alone, and we've seen in the case of Iran in particular that just doesn't tend to work very well. The Iran nuclear deal in 2015, whatever its flaws, that it did have flaws. It was there's so many parts of it expired relatively soon, and so there were concerns about whether it was going to be the sort of long-term fix to the nuclear problem. But Trump decided, no, I'm going to solve this on my own. And not only did that approach fail, and Iran just kind of reneged on all its agreements and just started making as much enriched uranium as it possibly could, but it also alienated our partners who we need in order to put pressure on Iran. The reason that in the Obama administration sanctions worked against Iran was because everybody was participating, even countries like China that aren't necessarily on the same page on these things, but everybody at least nominally supported the idea of pressuring Iran, and that pressure fell apart under maximum pressure that the Trump administration tried to bring. It sort of punished Iran, but there were so many holes and gaps in sanctions. The Chinese no longer interested in helping us. The Iranians weren't. And so it really fell apart. And the result is today we see Iran very close to a nuclear weapon. They probably could break out very quickly within days or weeks if they wanted to.
How do you think the Trump administration would react to them obtaining a nuclear weapon or becoming close to it, closer than they are now?
Yeah, and that is, again, another extremely important question. And we can imagine, on one hand, Trump being somewhat impulsive and maybe deciding he wants to sort of teach the Iranians a lesson and ordering a military strike. Arguably, the United States is probably the only military power that could do significant damage to Iran's nuclear facilities because they're deep underground. They're not easily struck from the air. On the other hand, I do think that Trump does not want to see the United States involved in another Middle East conflict, and so he may look for other exits, and he may turn to allies and maybe to the region, to the Gulf Arabs and others, to try to get pressure on the Iranians to kind of stop their program or reverse it even. But that's all uncharted territory. We've never really been in that situation before with the Iranians, or with a leader like Trump, who really can't be predicted. And so I think we're walking into a potentially very dangerous time.
We did see him briefly put a focus on building a multinational approach to handling the region's issues with the Abraham Accords, of course. How do you think he will work to build off of the Abraham Accords in dealing with issues such as Israel and Gaza, Syria, and the conflict still that exists in Syria and Iran?
I happen to think that the Abraham Accords are probably, at least in terms of foreign policy, one of the most important things that the first Trump administration managed to achieve, is to kind of bring some kind of normalcy to relations between Israel and at least some of those Gulf Arab neighbors, not the Saudis, but the UAE and Bahrainis and others. And so there's potential there, at least, for some kind of grand deal that would allow Israel to normalize with other neighbors, chiefly the Saudis, and that's the most important one. The problem is what's happened in the last year and change with the Gaza conflict. Everything is up in the air right now. I think the Saudis still would like to see some kind of normalization, but frankly, they're also going to have some high demands. They're not going to allow Israel to say, we'll allow this normalization to happen, but forget about the Palestinians. There's no future, no pathway toward a Palestinian state. So I do feel that there are new complexities now. I think as recently as October 6, 2023, it did seem to be there was a possibility then of some kind of grand bargain that could really change the landscape diplomatically in the Middle East, and you could see these sort of ancient conflicts contained or controlled for the first time in our lifetimes. And Hamas and October 7 changed that. So the landscape has shifted. There's still a lot of people who would like to see a deal, including many of the players, including the Israelis, if they can get something they're satisfied with. But again, it's a different landscape, and there's so much we don't know going forward.
And how has the conflict in Israel sort of made this more complicated in building off the Abraham Accords?
It's for one thing, it's changed the politics within Israel. And over the last decade, we've seen this Israeli public becoming more and more resistant to the idea of an independent Palestinian state. It used to be something that majorities, or at least pluralities, of Israelis tended to support on some level. They felt that the ultimate path to peace would involve the creation of some kind of stable, peaceful Palestinian state. Now the support for an independent Palestinian state has completely disappeared in Israel. There's just no support for it, and it's hard to see how Israeli leaders get the political support and sort of the buy-in, especially from a hard right Israeli cabinet, for any kind of deal that offers a possibility of a Palestinian state, which I just feel is just too dangerous and too destabilizing for them to accept. And that just makes everything so much harder. And if there are no kind of good answers to the Palestinian problem, it sort of creates rippling effects for everyone. The Jordanians have they have half the population is Palestinian, and there's high sentiment within Jordan for doing something to kind of bring some kind of hope or fulfill the aspirations of the Palestinian people. And Egypt, you see the same. There's these sort of festering conflicts and crises that are going to be really hard to control or pacify. And I just feel like October 7 had just scrambled all of this, and we're really in uncharted territory in terms of at least that conflict and how it's going to be ultimately resolved.
So let's take a quick step back and look at what brought us to October 7th and where we are today in Israel and Gaza. My understanding is you're working on a book on this, right?
Yeah, it's a bit historical, but yeah, it gets into the roots of this a bit. Yeah.
So I know you can't condense a full book you've been working on for a year into just like simple terms, but sort of in broad strokes, how did we get here? Give us a touch of the background for our listeners about the situation in Israel and Gaza. And frankly, were you surprised by the conflict breaking out?
I was surprised, actually, and I'll start with that. Everybody was surprised by what Hamas did on October 7th, partly because no one thought it had the capability, and nobody thought it had a sort of interest in attacking Israel in that way and provoking Israel. But what I have learned in my research, and I'm actually spending a lot of time looking more at the 60s and 70s, there's a parallel period right after the 1967 Six-Day War between Israel and its Arab neighbors, where, for the Palestinians, the last great hope that the Arab nations were going to be able to push back the Israelis and to restore this dream of Palestinian homeland, those dreams were crushed pretty much once and for all. That was 1973 in a different situation. But for the Palestinians, they lost hope that the Arab states were going to bail them out. And then they resorted to more extreme methods. It went from being an Israel versus Arab neighbors conflict to Israel versus Palestinian guerrillas. And when then that didn't go very well, the Palestinian guerrillas became Palestinian freedom fighters who struck internationally, who kind of brought in this wave of terrorism that most folks can't remember. But in the 1970s, there were hijackings every few days, and there was airport bombings and sort of the introduction of indiscriminate terrorist attacks against civilians all around the world, unrelated to the conflict at question. And you saw that, that kind of terrorism coming out of the hopelessness of post 1967. And you also saw, sort of the view of the global view of the Palestinian cause changing. Some people championing it, but a lot of people seeing it as militant and dangerous and possible to negotiate with. And we're dealing today with the sort of legacies of all those problems from that time. One thing I've also learned in my research is that the groups of the extreme answers, the ones that insist on sort of violence as a solution, it ends up sabotaging the ambitions and the dreams of the people they're claiming to represent. So these radicals in the 70s that began blowing up airplanes and airports, they didn't win anything for the Palestinians. They essentially made their plight worse, and they made sort of the dream of a state much more difficult to obtain, because they wouldn't accept any compromise. It was all, Israel is, we would eliminate Israel. It's a river to the sea, or nothing as far as they were concerned. So they were left with nothing.
Well, let's look a bit more at Hamas itself. They've obviously evolved in the region, both politically and militarily. How do you think they've evolved over the last 20 or 30 years to get to where they are now?
Yeah. With Hamas, it's interesting because there's been these two very contradictory currents. And on the one hand, you see Hamas finally kind of accepting the mantle of government and taking that somewhat seriously. And obviously we've seen now that they've diverted quite a lot of money, and that was not just the usual corruption, but for this tunnels project, a lot of aid and a lot of income coming into the enclave. We're going to build this unbelievable underground fortress that still sustains Hamas to this day. But you did have this pretense of trying to create normalcy and economic opportunity on one hand, mostly by the Hamas leaders outside the country, and on this undercurrent of people who never gave up on the idea that they were going to completely destroy Israel somehow. And what's been revelatory for me in my reporting since October 7 is being able to look at some of the plans and the documents that have been captured in Hamas tunnels and some of their operating bunkers, and just see how convinced they were that this would work, that there was a possibility still that they could ignite something that would result in the destruction of Israel as we know it. And most of our neighbors have long given up on that idea. Hamas didn't, and their rhetoric, which is always extreme, was matched by their plan. They really did feel that they were going to destroy Israel and that the rest of the Arab world would join their cause. And what they've got instead is wrecked remnants of what used to be their homeland, and sort of setting back any kind of ambition for independence, by decades, I think.
So we're now a little more than a year into the conflict, and obviously they haven't wrecked Israel, removed it from the map. Do they still think they can do that? Mm-hmm. Do they still think there's a world where they can get Hezbollah or other sort of extremist factions to actually rise up and somehow win the war? How do they see this war ending? Yeah. And what is their aim today? If it once started as winning, how do they win in their mind?
So interestingly, Sinwar, who is the sort of the architect of October 7, continued to believe until the day he was killed that he was winning. And that despite the destruction of Hamas or Gaza around him, and it's a lot big parts of the country are essentially rubble fields, and thousands of his fighters are dead, and most of the leaders of October 7 are dead. But he felt in his core cadre, the ones that sort of part of this militant wing of Hamas, still believe that they are on a winning trajectory. They believe it partly because they think the world's public opinion is on their side, that eventually Israel will be pressured into accepting compromise. But they also believe they're winning because they see new recruits. They see money coming in. It's difficult now to get money into Gaza, but people want to give money because they feel like Israel needs to be punished. And in talking to people from Hamas and talking to Palestinian leaders in the occupied territories, they keep saying that this has been a recruitment bonanza for Hamas. That every time you have an orphan teenager, or you have a family that's been torn apart, or a father that's lost his children, you have people who think of one thing only, and that's revenge. And so now there's this endless pool of this kind of anger and hostility to tap into. And that is potentially something that could keep Hamas or something like it going and sort of fuel the rage that is already sweeping the region, but to keep that going at a very high level for years to come.
In Black Flags, you wrote about how the U.S. invasion in Iraq really gave way to people such as al-Qari and al-Baghdadi, and it also created a great sort of recruitment mechanism for al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then other factions that became the Islamic State later on. Of course, the Iraq War started 21 years ago and ended kind of now-ish, but really never ended entirely.
Yeah.
So do you think this conflict could continue to evolve and exist in the region for as long as the Iraq War and the sort of aftermath of that?
Yeah. You do get the sense that these are, perpetual conflicts, and that the things that drive them are so hard to address from the outside. These are just, it's just like the Sunni-Shia conflict. As much as we try to imagine ways that we can try to get groups to accommodate one another and understand one another, there are reasons that are kind of beyond our understanding that they keep those flames lit. What I think is fascinating, and particularly if you go back to this Arkawi story, is how well these terrorist leaders and these sort of militant leaders anticipated the problems that we were going to have with them. And Zarqawi, way back before the U.S. invasion in 2003, came up with this, what would have seemed like just a crazy idea, I think, to most people. He really thought that the United States was going to invade Iraq. A lot of people didn't really see it happening, but he thought that was going to occur, and that it was going to be just a disaster for the Americans. They might come in and be triumphant at the beginning, but they were going to bring to Iraq the war that he always wanted, which is going to be this war of, a guerrilla war, a war of attrition, a war to kind of weaken the great Satan, to force us to pour a lot of money and to spend a lot of lives and treasure in fighting him. And he could do that indefinitely. He didn't feel, that this was a one-sided fight for him. He felt like he was fighting on his playground, and eventually his side would win. And his analysis wasn't that far off. Eventually it cost him his life. And after Zarqawi was killed, the American sort of counterinsurgency, strategy just got a lot smarter. We got a lot better at finding the hideouts of some of these Al-Qaeda and Iraq groups and beat them back for a very long time. But then, out of that sort of crushed movement, we get something worse, which is the Islamic State, which was sort of the natural evolution of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It just changed its name and got new leadership. It became more Iraqi focused and became something much more dangerous, much more virulent. sort of much more contagious than Zarqawi's group.
So, given that leaders in Hamas have a similar, if you would say, similar view of how conflict is good for their recruitment and their long-term aims to eliminate Israel and to spread sort of an Arab state, do you think that the U.S. and European leaders sort of responded to October 6th last year, or October 7th?
Have not to this point. I mean, what we've done instead is watch Israel do what it felt like it needed to do, and it's been, frankly, just as for the rest of the world to see, it's pretty grueling. It's pretty brutal. It hasn't, given us any sense of what a future is going to look like. We still don't know what that's going to be. I think if there is a hope for some kind of permanent solution, it's going to have to involve Arab states coming in and taking a role, and Palestinian people accepting that presence. And there's some, a lot of people are hopeful that can happen, that there can be some kind of Arab force in the country that oversees the rebuilding of Gaza, unless people begin to have hope for a decent life for themselves. But we're not there yet, and we're kind of a long way from getting there. So I think that's an aspiration, but it's nowhere close to reality.
Of course, President-elect Trump will take office on January 20th, and he's going to be presented with a region that has this conflict between Israel and Gaza, also trying to pull Saudi Arabia closer, dealing with Iran's continued instability and ambitions at the same time. The one thing we haven't really dove into much is Iran. Mm-hmm. How do you think President Trump will attempt to work with Iran, if at all? Do you think that they are in a place where they want to deal with President Trump? And what would you recommend as the best approach in sort of dealing with them in the second administration?
I've been struck since the election by how the conversations in the Middle East have changed a little bit. I think there are a lot of people in the Middle East that were betting on a Trump presidency, that Trump was going to be elected. They were much more confident in the outcome than most Americans were. And so they kind of saw this coming, and some feel that it may be in their interest to have someone like Trump in the White House who is less constrained in good ways and bad ways. And what I mean by that is that as kind of anti-Iran as Trump's rhetoric has been, and the people around him certainly are just, they're kind of fire breathers in that extent. They hate the Iranian nuclear core. They're suspicious of everything that Iran does, and just kind of bellicose in their language. And at the same time, Trump does see himself as this international deal maker. And there are people that are kind of looking a little down the road and thinking, well, maybe Trump will see an opportunity here to really change the landscape in the region. And that would be by cutting some kind of sort of the ultimate deal with the Iranians, in which he can get them to back off on the nuclear program in return for lifting sanctions or other kinds of benefits that would appeal to them. And frankly, the Iranians are in a place where they might be, they might welcome a deal, or at least a discussion about a deal, because their economy's in terrible shape. The regime is unpopular. They do worry about a broader war as much as they sometimes seem to think they want one with their actions. They don't really want a fight with the United States, and they don't really want to fight with Israel. So, with these kind of crises, sometimes, strange opportunities emerge. And I feel there are people that do sense the possibility that something could change, just because there's all these new cards on the table and so much uncertainty, and maybe people want to grab onto something that feels like a way out, including the Iranians. So, I'm not ruling that out as something that could happen.
We did see, though, in his first term, he went out of his way to befriend the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and other leaders in Saudi. It would seem to me that Saudi Arabia would have a preference in Iran not becoming particularly strong in the region. There can probably only be one really strong Arab state. Do you think that his relationship with Saudi leadership could undermine his ability to work with Iran?
Yeah, the Iranians and the Saudis certainly have lots of enmity and lots of reasons for it. On the other hand, the one thing I think the Saudis don't want is a nuclear-armed Iran, and they don't want an Iran that's sort of threatening its neighbors with militia groups and that kind of thing. And I think they might be amenable to some kind of deal that would put restraints on Iran in terms of its certainly in terms of its weapons program, but also, again, forcing the Iranians to sort of dial back on some of the really agitating, destabilizing militia activity, which is, not just a problem for Israel, but it's a problem for the Saudis and the UAE because of the Yemenis, the Houthis,
Right.
and they're creating huge problems for shipping. They're sort of a pain in the butt for everyone right now, and so they, as much as they may have to hold their nose to do it, I think they would welcome some kind of grand bargain that would put the Iranians in a box, at least in terms of the nuclear ambitions go, and we'll see. I think they might even argue for that because it's in their interest too, at least in the short run.
Well, so to turn it even a little bit more towards Saudi Arabia, obviously Jamal Khashoggi was killed by the Saudis in 2018, and President Trump kind of let him off the hook very famously. And then they continued to arm the Houthis in Yemen, which has led to one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world today. Do you think that President Trump will at least attempt to rein in the sort of poor behavior in the region that they're undertaking? Or do you think that because he wants to work with Iran, he wants to work with them for sort of bigger, more long-term grand issues, he'll let these issues continue to slide, whether it be women's rights, humanitarian issues, or helping the Houthi rebels in Yemen?
I think Trump is just by instinct so transactional that my sense is he cares very little about those details. He doesn't care very much, certainly, about human rights or women's rights, where he's never made any profession of kind of even lip service to those kinds of objectives. So for him, it's what kind of deal that can I get that would help me, arguably help national security for the Americans, but also kind of be good for his legacy. And he can ignore a lot of bad stuff on the periphery if he can get this grand deal that he can talk about. I think it's not a joke for Trump to think that he might get a Nobel Prize someday. And if he's thinking about his legacy, you actually hear people. I see people kind of using those kinds of arguments and trying to talk Trump into doing things. If you achieve this, there could be a Nobel Prize in it for him.
Well, the president of Ethiopia just got a Nobel Prize, and he's overseeing a country with a genocide. I don't think Nobel Prizes are as sexy as they once were. On the
other hand, they're good for ratings. So it'd be a nice little trophy to add to his collection of Mar-a-Lago. So that's not an insignificant lure if you're trying to get Trump to do something.
Yeah. So we've spent a lot of time looking at where we are in the Middle East, where we've been, where are we going? If you were obviously reporting on the region in 2003 in the lead up to the Iraq War. You've been around for ISIS, the current conflicts. If you had a crystal ball and you could say, okay, it's 2044, where, this is an impossible thing to answer, but in broad strokes, where do you think the Middle East will head?
Yeah, I have to say that, and this is not to cop out on that, but there's, people overuse the term inflection point, but really it's where somewhere between an inflection point and a precipice. I'm not sure which it is, but it's one of those two, and it's not a comfortable place to be. There are possibilities that we can see some progress on some of the crises in the region, and that is because the calamities of the last year and a half do create opportunities. After 1973, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Out of that comes an Egyptian-Israeli peace accord, which no one really saw coming, but that was a result. So sometimes really big problems allow people to come up with really big solutions and answers to long-standing problems. On the other hand, there's so many things that are just unpredictable right now and trending in bad directions. The Hamas conflict. We might see a peace deal between the Hezbollah and Israel soon. That looks like, as we're recording this, that may be in the offing. It's looking encouraging. I don't see a near-term solution to the Gaza conflict, and at the very least, it looks obvious to me that the Israelis are going to be in Gaza for a long time, and that invites all kinds of problems. And you could see anything from another intifada, which we have had two of those, and they were extremely sort of lethal and destabilizing for Israel and for its neighbors. There's a possibility still that somebody's going to make a mistake or miscalculate, and there could be a serious war between the Iranians and Israelis. All these things are on the table. If there is a broader war, there could be serious implications for the rest of us, because Hezbollah does not just operate in Lebanon and Syria, but they have significant cells, sleeper cells, some call them, or just operatives who are around the world, including in the United States. They've tried in the past to commit acts of terrorism or to commit political assassinations. That could happen again. There's so many things that could go wrong that we can't really predict right now. So we're at this moment where I honestly don't know which way it's going to break. And I must, just personally speaking, not extremely confident that the new folks coming in to the Trump administration have a grounding at this point in all the issues that they're going to have to face. They're going to have to learn really quickly. In some cases, they're going to have to throttle back on what would be their typical impulses to act right away, or to sort of act in a maximalist way, when sometimes something much diplomacy or sort of deft handling of solutions might be more appropriate. So that is part of the uncertainty too, is how, so the Trump card in all this, and how things will play out with the Trump folks coming in. There are a lot of people that we're seeing in this incoming administration that have openly called for a conflict against Iran. And we know from our own history, sometimes these ambitions lead us to terrible places with repercussions for Americans.
Well, what do you think of the current team he's put in place so far?
So the thing that strikes me, and I will grant them the sort of, certainly don't need it from me, but they do have permission and latitude to bring in people who are ideologically aligned with the president and feel the same way about the world that he does. What worries me is when you see people coming in without any requisite experience. And I worry mostly, to be honest, about the director of national intelligence, a nominee who has just does not have anything approaching.
Talking about, of course, Tulsi Gabbard, who many people think could be a Russian asset, not in a conspiratorial way.
So, to be generous, she does not have any experience running a major agency, let alone overseeing 16 U.S. intelligence agencies. It's one of the most important jobs in the country for keeping the country safe. And beyond that, as you said, she's had a really disturbing tendency to kind of echo talking points of the Russians, and going to places like Syria and having photo ops with genocidal dictators and almost excusing their behavior. I've spent a lot of time writing about chemical weapons atrocities in Syria. It's one of the greatest sort of human rights calamities of our time, and she's been dismissive of those chemical weapons attacks and suggested that maybe they were false flag, or maybe it wasn't Assad at all, and just kind of repeating in a disturbing way these kind of talking points for people who are our adversaries.
So I would be remiss if we didn't speak a little more about Syria. You, of course, wrote a book, Red Line, in 2020 or
came out
2021, which details the chemical program in Syria and how it was handled. We can put this in the earlier part of the episode talking about Syria, but talk about President Obama's approach to dealing with the chemical weapons attack, when he famously declared in 2012 that it would be a red line if Assad used chemical weapons against his own citizens. And then in 2014, it happened. He did nothing. What were the implications for that, both in keeping the crisis going and also with the U.S.'s reputation around the world and not enforcing the things it says it will?
Yeah. So one thing I've learned in my book writing, and it's true in daily journalism. It's much more true when you're taking the time to write a book about a subject, that every kind of all the bullet points, all kind of the way that these big stories and international issues have been boiled down to kind of a conventional wisdom, that it almost always wrong. And the book doesn't exactly defend Obama's decision, but it shows the decisions that he made as kind of a consequence of a set of facts that he was confronted with at the time. And for the most part, his decisions were well thought out, had sort of a good basis in strategy and principle, and yet there were adverse consequences to every one of them. And one adverse consequence is that, when the United States did not follow up with its red line promise, it undermined the U.S. standing in the Middle East, particularly. America doesn't do what it says it's going to do. It certainly disillusioned a whole generation of opposition fighters in Syria that absolutely believed that after Assad gassed 1,400 of his own people in Damascus in 2013, that of course Obama was going to come to the rescue, and of course there'd be military strikes that would weaken Assad's regime and it would fall. Those expectations turned out to be not realistic. I don't think there was any chance that the United States was ever going to get involved in a serious way. Might have conducted a few airstrikes, but we've seen in recent history that airstrikes have very limited impact. Trump used airstrikes twice after chemical weapons attacks in Syria, and the result was not much. I mean, the airfields that we bombed were back in operation the same day, and it didn't deter him. It didn't stop him from using chemical weapons. What Obama did do, and this is kind of a story of Red Line, is, faced with a bad sort of set of choices, he decided the most impactful thing he could do was to force Syria to surrender its stockpile of chemical weapons, to unilaterally give up its most important strategic weapon. And that was quite an ask. It's something Syria didn't even want to acknowledge having, but it was the thing they had spent all these decades building, and they really thought of chemical weapons as their counterbalance to Israel's nuclear weapons. And Obama, with some pretty significant help from Russia, was able to persuade the Syrians to give up that entire stockpile. They didn't give it all up. There's some things that we know now that they retained, but something like 95% of these really dangerous weapons were taken out of the country and destroyed. And that has made not just the Syrians safer, but it's made the rest of us safer, because the last thing you want in a war zone where there are multiple militia groups fighting over territory is to have millions of gallons of sarin and other really bad chemical weapons just floating around that somebody could steal. And so that was the big disaster that the world avoided, and Obama got absolutely no credit for it.
So you don't really see it as a loss?
I don't see it as a loss in the sense that was something actually, a positive thing that came out of that. The bad was things that are a little bit, more ephemeral, things that it's harder to kind of pin down. How did that sort of reputational damage the United States suffered at the time, did that really affect things? Did it shift the outcome of the war in Syria? And some Syrians argued that it did. The fact that the United States did not drop bombs in 2013 in response to these chemical weapons attacks, that somehow allowed the war to shift in Syria's favor. And it turns out that's not the case. What really happened in Syria was that Russia and Iran became so heavily invested in Assad's survival that it almost didn't matter what the Americans in the West did. The United States actually pumped billions of dollars in weapons to Syrian rebels. It was a secret program called Operation Temper Sycamore that it created training of schools for Syrian opposition fighters, gave them all kinds of weapons, including sort of anti-tank weapons, enough that they could have prevailed and overcome, taken over Syria. But as it turns out, a lot of those weapons were just essentially sold or given away to really bad guys, some of the Islamist groups, including ISIS. Almost none of it helped push back, the Syrian forces even by a mile or two. So it was a huge effort. It eventually just didn't make a difference, and we were never prepared to get as deeply involved in Syria as the Iranians and the Russians were, and so we just could not have changed the trajectory of that war.
A lot of folks argue that Obama's decision to not intervene at the scale that many believed he should have or would have was also because he wanted to not upset Iran, right? The Shia Crescent, sort of to keep open the door for the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal, which was, of course, in place from 2015 until Trump removed us by 2018
is when he walked out,
Right. Do you think that even if Obama was correct in his approach to Syria, that he did use, and the U.S. used too much capital in chasing a deal, which was always going to be hard to keep in place for multiple administrations, when they could have, for example, taken a much more aggressive approach in supporting, for example, the Green Revolution in Iran in 2009, which Obama described as his biggest foreign policy failure, or by slapping Syria, though you say you wouldn't have agreed with that, or by being more aggressive with Saudi Arabia. But it seems to a lot of folks, perhaps myself included, that they used almost all of their capital in the region to get the nuclear deal, despite the fact it was hard to keep in place. Kind of like on the domestic front, using all your capital for healthcare, which takes a million agencies and no one understands. Why not use it towards the other more pressing issues, such as the humanitarian crises?
Yeah, and I think this is going to be the thing that historians will consider and reflect on for years to come, because it is an open question to me whether or not this extreme focus on nuclear weapons, to the neglecting a lot of other big problems, neglecting the militia activity by the Iranians, which was a serious problem even before October 7, and then just what we've seen since then. Kind of giving the Iranians a pass for a lot of bad behavior around the world, to keep them on at the negotiating table, to try to to really try to stop them from doing this one thing that we calculated was probably the most destabilizing thing that the Iranians were doing, which is working on a nuclear weapon. I can remember in 2012 when just the very first efforts to secure this deal were coming into focus. Just how close we were to a war at that time, with Netanyahu threatening regularly that that Iran was reaching a point where it was just not acceptable anymore. Israel was going to have to act unilaterally, and if Israel acted, the United States probably would get pulled in some way. So we tried all these other things. We tried sort of really fancy covert operations where we used computer viruses to sabotage their equipment. This thing's famously known as the Stuxnet operation, but all the focus and all the energy went into solving this one core problem, which was an important one. Whether that was just looking at the Iran problem too narrowly and just through this single lens, whether that was a mistake or not, I'm not sure. I feel like I can understand the why they did it at the time. Looking back now, one has to wonder that was it really that great of a threat that we can push all these other problems aside just to take care of this one issue that that was just a temporary solution at best. I mean, the restraints that Iran was put under of the nuclear deal were quite impressive. They really were forced to get rid of a lot of stuff and to kind of mothball some of their equipment. But again, it was designed so that they could resume that activity as early as 2030 or 2035, and in which case people wonder, well, what's the point?
So we've, of course, had you for 45 minutes. I don't want to keep you forever, but I guess my final question would be, what would be the biggest potential crisis or problem the U.S. needs to be monitoring in the Middle East that maybe isn't on the radar yet?
Yeah.
We, of course, didn't know about ISIS. We knew about Al-Qaeda, 15 years ago, but a lot of the problems that have popped up around the world are always sometimes hard to foresee. Are there any things that you can foresee being an issue that we're not watching yet?
The one thing that I worry about is just because the way that technology is developing, there are all these groups that sort of have the ideological reasons to want to hurt us. They can't do it directly, but they're very used to, they're very comfortable with asymmetric warfare. In the past, asymmetric warfare often meant terrorist attacks or that kind of mischief making that just kills a few civilians and creates bedlam, but doesn't really hurt our security. But now, the potential for some of these groups to do serious damage through cyber attacks, which the Iranians are spending a lot of time working on, their capabilities, biological, chemical attacks without a signature, things that you get, especially on the bio side, engineered pathogens. That used to be like science fiction stuff. It's not anymore. It's something that is within the capability, certainly, of American scientists and other Westerners, and it's be foolish to exclude the possibility that Iranians and others are working on things like that too, or there's chemical weapons keep becoming more sophisticated. There are things that our adversaries can do, and often using proxy groups or other indirect means to cause real problems, to shut down, good chunks of our economy. And I worry that as these problems continue to escalate and as capabilities become more advanced, that the surprise will come in a technological area that we really won't see coming. all of the world has witnessed in the last few years what a virus can do, and how a virus not just takes a lot of lives, but shuts down global economies. And we're still recovering from the damage of that time. And then we can just drive around Washington, D.C., and we see the shuttered restaurants and all the other kind of impacts from that. But can you imagine, engineered pathogens, something that's a lot more difficult to detect, that doesn't respond well to antibiotics or therapeutics? Those are things that the Soviets were thinking about in the last days of the Cold War. They never really got around to making, but the capability of creating those things is advanced, so that people in a routine, university laboratory or a fairly sophisticated private lab somewhere in the world can be working on those things as well. And I think that's kind of the black swan event that worries me the most.
Okay, Joby, you've written a number of great books: Black Flags, The Triple Agent, and The Red Lines. What are you working on now, and where can we find it, and when can we find it?
So I'm always kind of got a foot in several areas, everything from the Ukraine conflict. I'm actually finishing up a story right now that looks at the attempt over the last 3 years to try to stop stop Russia, from being able to make the weapons it uses to fight the Ukrainians, and why that has been mostly a futile effort, and how, despite hundreds of sanctions against all kinds of companies, that the Russians still managed to get Western microchips and other components that, often from American companies. It's extraordinary when these drones are shot down and they open them up and there's just, half of the electronics are American. So that's it's sort of a problem we've never been able to fix. And also spending a lot of time working on Iran and where things are going with its nuclear intentions. It's something that we're right now, again, at a crossroads. There's a possibility of new negotiations and agreement, but at the moment, Iran is just getting closer and closer to having the ability to make a bomb almost immediately if it wants to. So those are things I work on all the time, and there's usually 50 other things going on in the background, plus a book I'm trying to write. So it's a pretty busy time.
Wonderful. And they, of course, can follow your work at the Washington Post, but also, I assume, on Twitter and X.
Yeah.
Do you have a handle on there?
Twitter is just Joby Warrick. And,
there you go.
Just got on Blue Sky.
I have not yet, but Joby, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
This is a lot of fun. Thank you, Nathan.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to share it with friends and tune in next time.